David Harrison's hand froze mid-reach for his car door, his breath catching as the impossible scene unfolded before him. Under the ancient oak tree in Griffith Park, a barefoot girl in torn jeans was teaching calculus, advanced calculus, to his 11-year-old daughter, Charlie, who had never passed a single math test in her life. This wasn't some playground game. The homeless child was solving differential equations in the dirt. Charlie's private tutor stumbled backward, his $200 an hour confidence shattered as he watched his learning-disabled student suddenly grasp concepts that had eluded her for months. The man's briefcase hit the ground, spilling expensive materials across the grass like worthless confetti. David's chest tightened as memories crashed over him. Elizabeth's final words about not forgetting where he came from, Charlie's tear-stained report cards hidden in his desk drawer, the crushing weight of his $50 billion empire that couldn't buy his daughter the one thing she needed most. Someone who believed in her. "Security," he whispered into his phone, then stopped. His trembling finger hovered over the call button. Who was this girl? And why did she succeed where Harvard graduates had failed? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Griffith Park as two worlds existed in the same space, invisible to each other until this moment. David Harrison had built his empire on recognizing patterns, on seeing opportunities others missed, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of his daughter, his brilliant, struggling, heartbroken daughter, finally understanding mathematics through the gentle guidance of a child who shouldn't even be in school. Lily Grace Thompson sat cross-legged in the dirt, her father's military dog tags catching the light as she moved. At 12, she possessed the kind of raw intelligence that universities spent fortunes trying to cultivate, yet she lived in a rusted 1998 Winnebago with her grandmother Margaret, surviving on food bank donations and the kindness of strangers. Her torn sneakers had been repaired with duct tape so many times they looked more silver than their original blue. But when she spoke about numbers, about the elegant dance of equations and theorems, her eyes blazed with the fire of pure discovery. "See, Charlie," Lily was saying, using a stick to draw fractions in the packed earth. "Numbers aren't your enemy. They're like music. Once you hear the rhythm, everything starts to make sense." She broke a granola bar into pieces, demonstrating how 3/4 looked different from 1/2. How the relationships between parts and wholes weren't abstract concepts but real, tangible truths you could hold in your hands. Charlotte. Charlie Harrison had never felt this clarity before. At 11, she carried the weight of being the daughter everyone whispered about. The tech billionaire's child who couldn't add simple fractions, who sat silently in the back of her elite classroom while teachers spoke too fast and expected too much. Her dyslexia remained undiagnosed, hidden behind expensive private tutoring and her father's unconscious shame. She had grown accustomed to feeling stupid, to the pitying looks when she stumbled over words or reversed numbers. But here, under this tree, with Lily's patient voice guiding her through mathematical concepts that had seemed impossibly foreign just hours before, she felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Smart. David himself carried secrets that would have shocked the business world. The man who owned 3 homes worth more than most people's lifetime earnings had grown up in a trailer park in Riverside, where his mother worked double shifts at the diner and his father drank away their grocery money. He had clawed his way out of poverty through pure determination and ruthless focus, building Harrison Tech from a garage startup into a global powerhouse. But success had come at a cost. When his wife Elizabeth died of cancer 2 years ago, her final words haunted him. "Don't let success make you forget where you came from, David. Don't let our daughter grow up thinking love is something you earn instead of something you give." Now, Watching this homeless girl accomplish what Harvard-educated tutors could not, David felt the ground shift beneath his perfectly polished Italian shoes. Everything he thought he knew about worth, about value, about what it meant to truly teach and truly learn, crumbled like autumn leaves in his manicured hands. The decision to approach rather than call security marked the first time in 20 years that David Harrison chose curiosity over control. His footsteps crunched softly on the fallen leaves as he moved closer, and both girls looked up with startled expressions. Charlie with guilt, as if caught in some forbidden act, and Lily with the wariness of someone who had learned that adults in expensive suits rarely brought good news. "Don't stop on my account," David said quietly, settling onto the grass despite his $1,000 suit. "I'd like to understand what's happening here." Charlie's face flushed crimson. "Daddy, I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything, sweetheart." David's voice carried a gentleness that surprised even him. He turned to Lily, noting how she instinctively moved protectively closer to Charlie. "I'm David Harrison, Charlie's father." Lily's grip tightened on the stick she'd been using to draw equations. "I know who you are, sir. I'm not trying to cause trouble. Charlie she needed help with her homework, and I was here anyway." "Here anyway?" David's business instincts kicked in, reading the subtext in her careful words. "Do you live nearby?" The pause stretched too long, filled with the distant sounds of traffic and bird song. Lily glanced toward the parking lot where the battered Winnebago sat like a rust-stained island among the sleek vehicles of park joggers and dog walkers. "My grandmother and we stay mobile. It's easier that way." David followed her gaze and felt something twist in his chest. The RV's windows were covered with cardboard and duct tape, and he could see extension cords snaking from the vehicle to a maintenance building, stealing electricity. This child lived there. This brilliant, articulate child who was teaching his daughter advanced mathematics lived in a broken-down motorhome in a public parking lot. "Show me," he said suddenly. "Show me how you're teaching her." For the next hour, David watched in amazement as Lily guided Charlie through concepts that had frustrated them both for months. She didn't just explain the mechanics of mathematical operations, she painted pictures with numbers, telling stories where fractions became characters with personalities, where algebraic equations revealed their secrets through gentle coaxing rather than brute force memorization. "Math is like cooking, Charlie," Lily explained, working through a particularly complex word problem. "You don't just throw ingredients together and hope for the best. You have to understand how they work together, what each one brings to the recipe. See, this number here, the coefficient, it's like salt. A little bit transforms everything, but too much ruins the whole dish." Charlie's eyes lit up with understanding that David had never seen before. His daughter, who had been labeled as having learning difficulties by every expensive educational consultant he'd hired, was not only grasping these concepts but beginning to extend them, asking questions that showed genuine mathematical thinking. "Where did you learn to teach like this?" David asked Lily during a brief break when Charlie ran to get water from the fountain. Lily's hand went unconsciously to the dog tags around her neck. "My daddy was good with numbers. Before the war messed up his head. He used to say that math was the only language that never lied, never tried to trick you. And my grandmother—" She paused, something complicated crossing her young face. "Grandma Maggie knows things. When she's having a good day, she knows lots of things." "What kind of things?" "Numbers, mostly. Patterns. She taught me about the Fibonacci sequence when I was 8, showed me how it appears in sunflower centers and spiral shells." Lily's voice took on a dreamy quality, as if recounting a favorite fairy tale. "She says numbers are God's signature on creation, that if you know how to look, you can see his handwriting everywhere." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. This wasn't just street smarts or natural talent. This child had been receiving instruction at a level that would challenge graduate students. Is your grandmother a teacher? She used to be something. Before Daddy died, before she started forgetting things. Lily's voice became carefully neutral, the practiced tone of someone who had learned not to reveal too much. She has good days and bad days now. When Charlie returned, bubbling with excitement about a connection she'd made between the math lesson and a pattern she'd noticed in her art class, David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning home to his climate-controlled office and afternoon conference calls, he asked if he could meet Lily's grandmother. The walk to the RV felt like crossing between dimensions. With each step away from his BMW and toward the rusted vehicle, David shed layers of assumption and privilege. The Winnebago was ancient, held together by determination and duct tape, but it was meticulously clean. Someone had attempted to create a garden in plastic containers arranged around the entrance. Herbs and small vegetables that spoke of careful tending and hope despite impossible circumstances. Margaret Chen Thompson emerged from the RV like a figure from a half-remembered dream. At 68, she moved with the careful precision of someone fighting an invisible battle, her silver hair perfectly braided despite her obviously limited resources. When she spoke, her voice carried traces of an accent that suggested education, culture, a life that had once been very different. "Lily, sweetheart," Margaret said, her eyes sharp and focused as they took in David's expensive clothing. "Who is our visitor?" "This is Charlie's father, Grandma Maggie, Mr. Harrison. He wanted to meet you." Margaret's gaze shifted to David, and for a moment he felt as if he were being examined under a microscope. "Harrison," she repeated slowly. "Harrison Tech, I presume." The quantum computing patents from 2018 were quite impressive, though I noticed some inefficiencies in your error correction algorithms. David's mouth fell open. This homeless woman living in a parking lot had not only heard of his company's most advanced research, but understood it well enough to critique it. "You're familiar with quantum computing?" Margaret's smile was enigmatic. "I'm familiar with many things, Mr. Harrison. The question is, what are you familiar with? And more importantly, what are you willing to learn?" As if summoned by some invisible signal, Margaret's expression suddenly shifted. The sharp intelligence flickered like a candle in wind, replaced by confusion and fear. "Lily, where are the car keys? We need to go home. The lecture starts at 3 and I can't be late again." Lily was beside her grandmother instantly, her thin arms wrapping around the older woman's trembling shoulders. "It's okay, Grandma Maggie. We are home. The lecture was yesterday, remember? You did beautifully." David watched this 12-year-old child comfort her grandmother with the practiced skill of a professional caregiver, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding of strength, of responsibility, of what it truly meant to love without conditions. That evening, David Harrison sat in his home office staring at a computer screen that revealed truths more shocking than any corporate acquisition or market crash he'd ever navigated. The background check on Rick Thompson had started as a routine precaution, a billionaire's due diligence when his daughter befriended a homeless child. What emerged from the digital investigation shattered every assumption he'd made about worthiness, about the randomness of fate, and about the thin line between success and catastrophe. Staff Sergeant Richard "Rick" Thompson, United States Army. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Purple Heart recipient. Cybersecurity specialist who, in March 2003, had prevented what would have been the most devastating cyber attack in Harrison Tech's early history. David's hands trembled as he read the incident report he'd buried in his company's archives, filed away and forgotten in the rush of subsequent success. The attack had come at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, targeting Harrison Tech's financial servers during a critical investor presentation week. A sophisticated breach that would have wiped out client data, destroyed investor confidence, and killed David's fledgling company before it could truly begin. But Rick Thompson, working a security contract through his veteran-owned firm, had caught the intrusion in real time. For 16 straight hours, Rick had battled the hackers in digital combat, tracing their methods, closing vulnerabilities, and ultimately saving not just David's company, but the personal data of over 100,000 clients. David remembered now. He remembered the young veteran who had appeared in his office the next day, exhausted but determined to deliver the security report in person. Rick had refused the substantial bonus David offered, saying only, "I've got everything I need, sir. Just keep building something that matters." David had offered Rick stock options, a permanent position, a chance to grow with the company. Rick had smiled that easy soldier's smile and replied, "Keep that opportunity for your kids, brother. I got my own path to walk." That path, David now realized with crushing clarity, had led to a trailer in Riverside, to struggles with PTSD that the system had failed to address, to mounting medical bills that no veteran should have faced alone. The records painted a devastating picture. Rick's gradual descent from decorated war hero to broken man, his battles with nightmares and flashbacks, his wife's death from complications during childbirth, leaving him alone to raise Lily while caring for his ailing stepmother, Margaret. The final entries in Rick's file read like a Greek tragedy. In 2019, Rick had invested his life savings in cryptocurrency, hoping to secure his daughter's educational future. He'd been scammed by a sophisticated fraud scheme that targeted veterans specifically, losing not just his money but his faith in his ability to protect the people he loved most. The suicide note, which David accessed through channels that wealth and influence provided, contained only one line about Lily. "Tell my little star that numbers don't lie, but people do. Tell her daddy loved her too much to keep failing her." Charlie found her father crying at his desk at midnight, something she had never witnessed in her 11 years of life. "Daddy, are you sick?" David pulled his daughter onto his lap, holding her with desperate tenderness. "No, sweetheart. I'm thinking about how connected everything is, about how we never really know whose lives we touch or who touches ours." "Are you thinking about Lily?" "I'm thinking about Lily's father. About choices and chances, and about how sometimes the people who save us never know they've done it." David's voice carried a weight that made Charlie wrap her arms around his neck instinctively. The next morning brought a crisis that transformed David's abstract guilt into urgent action. His phone rang at 6:23 a.m. Lily's voice, small and terrified in a way that cut through his sleep like a knife. "Mr. Harrison, I'm sorry to call so early, but I didn't know who else. Grandma Maggie is gone." David was out of bed and reaching for clothes before she finished the sentence. "Gone how? What happened?" She woke up confused. Really confused. She started screaming about being late for work, about needing to get to the lab. I tried to calm her down, but she pushed me and ran. That was 3 hours ago. I've looked everywhere, but... Lily's voice broke. "Sir, she doesn't remember where she is when she gets like this." She could be anywhere. David found Lily in the Griffith Park parking lot, still in her pajamas, her feet bare and bleeding from running on asphalt. She had been searching since 3 a.m., calling Margaret's name until her voice was raw, checking every shadow and doorway in a desperate radius around their temporary home. The sight of this child, this brilliant, loving child, taking responsibility for an adult's safety in a way that no 12-year-old should ever have to, ignited something fierce and protective in David's chest. "We'll find her," he promised, pulling out his phone to call private security, police contacts, Anyone who could expand the search. Charlie's at school, but I've cleared my schedule. We'll find her together. The search took 4 hours and revealed the depth of Margaret's condition in heartbreaking detail. Security cameras captured her wandering through the USC campus at dawn, approaching strangers to ask about lecture halls that had been torn down decades ago. A campus security guard found her in the mathematics building, sitting in an empty classroom, writing complex equations on a whiteboard with the focused intensity of someone who had forgotten everything except the language of numbers. When David and Lily arrived at the university, they found Margaret surrounded by 3 graduate students and a professor, all staring in amazement at the whiteboard covered in her work. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the department head, looked up as they entered with an expression of confused wonder. "Excuse me, but is this woman with you? Because what she's written here, it's extraordinary. These equations, they're solving problems in quantum field theory that we've been working on for months. Where did she study?" Lily ran to her grandmother, who looked up with the dazed smile of someone returning from a long journey. "Lily, sweetheart, I was teaching. Wasn't I teaching?" "Yes, Grandma Maggie." "You were teaching." Lily's voice was steady, but David could see her hands shaking as she gently cleaned the marker stains from Margaret's fingers. Dr. Walsh pulled David aside, her voice low and urgent. "Sir, I don't know what this woman's situation is, but that work on the board, it's breakthrough-level research. If she's homeless, if she needs help, the university has resources. Scholars like this, they don't just appear from nowhere." "Actually," David said quietly, "they do. But only if we're not paying attention." The drive back to the RV was silent except for Margaret's soft humming, a lullaby that seemed to comfort both her and Lily. David watched in the rearview mirror as Lily held her grandmother's hand, stroking the papery skin with infinite gentleness, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. That afternoon, while Margaret napped and Lily sat guard beside her, David made a series of phone calls that would change everything. To his lawyer first, then to private medical specialists, then to his accountant to discuss establishing a trust fund. By evening, he had created the framework for what would become the Thompson Foundation, named not just for Rick and Lily but for Margaret, Dr. Margaret Chen Thompson, whose brilliant mind deserved better than to fade away in bureaucratic indifference. When Charlie arrived from school to find her father sitting outside the RV with Lily, sharing takeout Chinese food and watching Margaret tend to her container garden during a lucid moment, she didn't ask questions. She simply sat down between them, took Lily's hand, and said, "This feels right, doesn't it, Daddy?" David looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw Elizabeth's wisdom shining in her young eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, for the first time in a very long time, something feels exactly right." The transformation began with small changes that rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Within a week of David's decision to help, Lily and Margaret had moved from the parking lot RV into a furnished apartment in Silver Lake, close enough to Griffith Park that the girls could maintain their daily lessons under the oak tree, but safe enough that David could sleep at night knowing they had heat, running water, and walls that wouldn't collapse in the next earthquake. Charlie's academic renaissance continued to astonish everyone except Lily, who had never doubted her friend's intelligence. Test scores that had languished in the bottom quartile suddenly soared to the top 10%. Teachers who had whispered about learning disabilities and private school inappropriateness now spoke in hushed, amazed tones about Charlie's miraculous breakthrough. The transformation was so dramatic that Dr. Patricia Whitman, Westfield Academy's formidable headmistress, requested a meeting with David to discuss what she termed unusual circumstances requiring investigation. Mr. Harrison, Dr. Whitman said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in elite education. "Charlie's improvement is unprecedented. In my experience, such sudden academic gains typically indicate either undiagnosed learning differences being properly addressed or outside assistance that our policies require us to examine." David sat across from her in the mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by portraits of Westfield's illustrious alumni, senators, tech moguls, Hollywood dynasties, and felt the familiar weight of institutional expectation. "Are you suggesting my daughter is cheating?" "I'm suggesting that children don't typically advance from remedial mathematics to calculus readiness in 2 weeks without extraordinary intervention. Our concern is ensuring that any tutoring she's receiving meets our academic integrity standards and doesn't create unfair advantages over her peers." The unspoken subtext hung heavy in the air. Westfield Academy maintained its reputation by controlling variables, by ensuring that their carefully curated student body succeeded within predictable parameters. Charlie's sudden excellence threatened the delicate ecosystem of managed achievement that parents paid $60,000 annually to maintain. "And if I told you that Charlie's tutor is a 12-year-old homeless girl who lives in Silver Lake?" Dr. Whitman's perfectly composed expression flickered. "Mr. Harrison, I hope you're not suggesting that our students should be exposed to unstable elements from outside our community. The safety and security of our children must remain paramount." David felt something crystallize in his chest, a clarity that had been building since that first afternoon under the oak tree. "Dr. Whitman, that unstable element has accomplished in 2 weeks what your institution couldn't achieve in 2 years. Perhaps the question isn't whether Lily meets your standards, but whether your standards are worth meeting." Meanwhile, Lily was navigating her own transformation with characteristic grace and hidden anxiety. The apartment, with its clean walls and functioning appliances, felt simultaneously like a miracle and a trap. She had grown accustomed to the mobility of homelessness, to the ability to disappear when situations became too complicated or dangerous. Permanent address meant permanent visibility, and visibility meant questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Margaret's condition fluctuated with the stress of change. The familiar routine of the RV, the predictable limitations of their mobile life, had provided a structure that her failing mind could navigate. The apartment, with its multiple rooms and modern conveniences, sometimes sent her into spirals of confusion that left her standing in the bathroom at 3 a.m., calling for her long-dead husband and asking where she'd left her lecture notes. "Lily, sweetheart," Margaret would whisper during her 2 a.m. wanderings, "where did we put the final proofs? The committee expects them tomorrow, and if I'm late again, they'll give my tenure to that insufferable man from Stanford." These moments required all of Lily's accumulated wisdom and patience. She would guide Margaret back to bed, speaking in the gentle tones she'd learned from years of managing psychiatric emergencies, reminding her grandmother that the work was finished, that she could rest now, that she had already proven everything she needed to prove. David began spending more time at the Silver Lake apartment, initially under the pretense of checking on their adjustment, but increasingly because he found peace there that his Beverly Hills mansion couldn't provide. Margaret, during her lucid hours, possessed an intellectual curiosity and depth of knowledge that challenged him in ways his boardrooms never had. She would quiz him about Harrison Tech's algorithms with the casual expertise of someone who had been thinking about computational problems since before he was born, offering suggestions that his MIT-educated engineers would later describe as brilliantly obvious once someone actually says them out loud. "Your error correction protocols," Margaret mentioned one evening, reviewing code on David's laptop while Lily and Charlie worked on homework at the kitchen table. "They're elegant but inefficient. You're approaching quantum decoherence like a classical problem." What if you treated the errors not as bugs, but as features? What if the system's tendency to lose coherence could be harnessed rather than prevented? David stared at the screen, seeing patterns he'd missed despite years of development. You're suggesting we work with quantum instability rather than against it? I'm suggesting that nature rarely makes mistakes, Mr. Harrison. When your quantum states refuse to maintain coherence, perhaps they're trying to tell you something important about the problems you're actually meant to solve. The conversation led to a breakthrough in Harrison Tech's quantum research that would later be valued at over $200 million. Margaret, who had been dismissed by society as a confused elderly woman living in poverty, had casually solved problems that had stumped teams of highly paid specialists. But success brought new complications. Charlie's improvement at Westfield had attracted attention from other parents who began asking pointed questions about her suddenly exceptional performance. Rumors circulated about secret tutoring programs, about David Harrison giving his daughter unfair advantages through expensive private instruction. The whispers grew louder when Charlie, who had never voluntarily spoken in class, delivered a presentation on mathematical patterns in nature that left her teacher speechless and her classmates scrambling to understand how the slow girl had become the class genius overnight. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference in November. Mrs. Alexandra Pemberton, whose son Bradley had been Charlie's primary academic rival until her recent transformation, cornered David in the school parking lot with accusations wrapped in the polite language of elite concern. David, we're all thrilled about Charlie's progress, of course, but some of us are wondering about the fairness implications. If there's some new tutoring method or program that's producing these remarkable results, don't you think it should be made available to all our children? The competitive balance of the class seems, well, disrupted. David looked at this woman, whose family fortune came from defense contracts that profited from the same wars that had broken Rick Thompson, and felt a rage that surprised him with its intensity. Are you suggesting that my daughter doesn't deserve to succeed? Of course not. But when a child goes from remedial to advanced placement in a matter of weeks, it raises questions. The other parents are concerned that perhaps she's receiving assistance that goes beyond what's academically appropriate. What kind of assistance? Mrs. Pemberton's smile was sharp as surgical steel. Well, there are rumors about some sort of unusual tutoring situation, something involving homeless individuals. Surely you can understand our concern about exposing our children to unstable elements from outside our community? The phrase unstable elements echoed Dr. Whitman's earlier language, and David realized that Westfield Academy's leadership had been discussing Lily, categorizing her as a threat to be managed rather than a miracle to be celebrated. The institution that claimed to nurture young minds was actively working to isolate his daughter from the person who had unlocked her potential. That night, David found Charlie crying in her room, holding a crude note that had been slipped into her backpack. Your crazy friend doesn't belong here. Tell her to go back where she came from before something bad happens. Daddy, Charlie whispered, they're saying terrible things about Lily. They're saying she's dangerous, that she's making other kids look bad. Some of the parents are demanding that the school do something to stop her from coming to the park. David felt the same protective fury that had driven him to build his empire, but channeled now towards something infinitely more important than market share or profit margins. Sweetheart, what do you want to do? Charlie's answer came without hesitation. I want to protect her, like she protected me. The next morning brought a crisis that would test every relationship and assumption in their newly formed family. David's phone rang at 5:47 a.m. with news that would shatter their fragile peace. Someone had called Child Protective Services with an anonymous tip about a homeless girl being exploited by a billionaire family, claiming that Lily was being used for illegal tutoring services and that Margaret was an unfit guardian whose mental condition posed a danger to a minor child. By 7 a.m., a social worker named Janet Morrison sat in the Silver Lake apartment, interviewing Margaret during one of her confused episodes, documenting the refrigerator contents, measuring the square footage, and asking Lily questions about her living situation with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen too many broken systems to believe in easy solutions. "Lily, honey, can you tell me about your daily routine? Who takes care of you when your grandmother has her bad days?" Lily sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, giving answers that revealed nothing while technically telling the truth. "I take care of myself, ma'am. I always have." "And Mr. Harrison? What's his role in your living situation?" "He's Charlie's father. He's been kind to us." "Kind how?" "Has he asked you to do anything in exchange for this kindness?" David watched from the doorway as this 12-year-old girl, who had survived years of homelessness and family tragedy with her dignity intact, faced the implied accusations with a composure that would have impressed courtroom attorneys. But he also saw the fear flickering behind her careful words, the recognition that this conversation could end with her and Margaret being separated, with their fragile stability dissolving back into the chaos they'd barely escaped. The interview lasted 2 hours and concluded with Janet Morrison's promise to file a report within 48 hours. The unspoken threat hung in the apartment like smoke. If the state determined that Margaret was unfit and that Lily's current situation was inappropriate, both the girl and her grandmother could be placed in separate facilities, their family bond severed by bureaucratic determination of what constituted proper care. That afternoon, under the oak tree where their friendship had begun, Lily and Charlie sat in silence while Margaret napped in the apartment and David made desperate phone calls to lawyers who specialized in family law. The autumn leaves fell around them like golden snow, marking the end of innocence and the beginning of a fight that would determine not just their individual futures, but their right to exist as the chosen family they had become. "Whatever happens," Charlie said finally, "we're sisters now, real sisters, and nobody gets to change that." Lily squeezed her friend's hand, feeling the weight of storms approaching, but also the strength that came from no longer facing them alone. "Real sisters," she agreed, and for the first time since the social worker's visit, she smiled. The emergency school board meeting was called for a Tuesday morning in December, ostensibly to address security concerns, but actually serving as a tribunal where privilege would judge poverty and find it wanting. David Harrison sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Westfield Academy, flanked by his attorney, facing 7 board members whose combined net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. At the center of the polished table sat Dr. Patricia Whitman, her expression carved from institutional authority and decades of protecting elite interests. "Mr. Harrison," Dr. Whitman began, her voice carrying the weight of predetermined conclusions, "we've called this meeting to discuss the concerning reports regarding your daughter's association with an individual who may pose risks to our school community. Our investigation has revealed that Charlotte's dramatic academic improvement coincides with her friendship with a homeless child of questionable background." David felt his jaw clench. Questionable background? Lily Thompson is 12 years old. A 12-year-old with no permanent address, no proper schooling, and a guardian whose mental instability has been documented by Child Protective Services, interjected board member Harrison Blackwood III, his tone suggesting that homelessness was a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Several parents have expressed concerns about this child's presence on school grounds and in the surrounding area. What specific concerns? Dr. Whitman consulted her notes with theatrical precision. reports of aggressive behavior, inappropriate solicitation of students, and the concerning influence she appears to exert over Charlotte. Your daughter's sudden academic transformation, while superficially positive, represents an unnatural deviation from established baselines that suggests external manipulation. The language was clinical, designed to pathologize kindness and criminalize connection. David looked around the table at faces he recognized from charity galas and political fundraisers, people who wrote checks to homeless shelters while ensuring that homeless individuals never actually entered their orbit. Are you seriously suggesting that a child helping my daughter with homework constitutes a threat? Board member Catherine Sterling Morris leaned forward, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she spoke. Mr. Harrison, surely you understand our position. Westfield Academy maintains its excellence through careful curation of influences. When outside elements disrupt the controlled environment we've created for our children's development, we must take protective action. Outside elements. David repeated the phrase slowly, tasting its implications. You mean poor people. We mean unstable individuals whose presence introduces variables we cannot control or predict, Dr. Whitman corrected smoothly. Our policies exist to protect all students, including your daughter, from potentially harmful influences. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope. These people, whose children had never known hunger or homelessness, whose teenagers drove cars worth more than most families earned in a year, were painting a brilliant, kind, struggling child as a threat to be eliminated. The very qualities that made Lily extraordinary, her resilience, her empathy, her ability to see potential where others saw problems, were being reframed as dangers requiring institutional intervention. What exactly are you proposing, Doctor? Whitman exchanged glances with the board members before continuing. We're issuing a formal restriction prohibiting this individual from entering school property or approaching students in the surrounding area. Additionally, we're recommending that Charlotte receive professional evaluation to address any psychological dependency that may have developed from this inappropriate relationship. David's attorney, Rebecca Chen, spoke for the first time. On what legal basis are you restricting a child's freedom of movement in public spaces? On the basis of protecting our students from potentially predatory behavior, Sterling Morris replied sharply. This homeless girl has clearly targeted Charlotte specifically, exploiting her academic struggles to create unhealthy dependency. Such manipulation tactics are textbook warning signs of grooming behavior. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. These people, in their desperation to maintain the barriers that separated them from society's problems, were willing to characterize a 12-year-old's kindness as predatory. They were so committed to their insulated worldview that they could not conceive of genuine altruism existing outside their philanthropic tax deductions. David stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with each word they had spoken. Dr. Whitman, members of the board, I want to make sure I understand your position clearly. You believe that Lily Thompson, a homeless child who has helped my daughter achieve academic success that your highly paid teachers could not, represents a threat to Westfield Academy's community. We believe that uncontrolled variables pose inherent risks to institutional stability, Dr. Whitman replied, her language becoming increasingly bureaucratic as she sensed the shift in David's demeanor. And your solution is to ban her from public spaces and label her as a potential predator? Our solution is to protect our students and maintain the educational excellence that parents pay substantial tuition to ensure. David looked around the table one final time, seeing these people clearly for perhaps the first time in his years of association with their institution. Then I believe we have a fundamental disagreement about what constitutes education and what deserves protection." He gathered his papers and stood. "Rebecca, please prepare withdrawal paperwork for Charlotte. She won't be returning to Westfield Academy." The boardroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Dr. Whitman's composure cracked visibly. "Mr. Harrison, surely you're not making an impulsive decision based on emotional reaction. Charlotte's future, her college prospects, her social development, these require institutional support that alternative arrangements simply cannot provide. Charlotte's future requires exposure to people who see her potential rather than her problems. It requires teachers who celebrate curiosity rather than controlling it. Most importantly, it requires an environment where kindness is recognized as strength, not threat." Blackwood leaned forward aggressively. "You're talking about throwing away everything we've built here. The connections, the networking opportunities, the pathway to Ivy League admission. All for what? Some misguided notion of social justice? I'm talking about choosing education over indoctrination. I'm talking about raising a daughter who values people based on their character rather than their address." David's voice carried a finality that made several board members shift uncomfortably. "And I'm talking about building something better than what you've created here." As he walked toward the boardroom door, Dr. Whitman made one final attempt to maintain control. "Mr. Harrison, if you remove Charlotte from Westfield, you'll be limiting her opportunities severely. Public schools, even the best ones, simply cannot provide the advantages that our institution offers." David paused at the threshold, turning back with a smile that contained both sadness and determination. "Dr. Whitman, in the past 3 months, my daughter has learned more about mathematics, compassion, and human potential than she did in 3 years at your institution. The only thing limiting her opportunities was staying here." The drive home felt like emergence from a cave into sunlight. David called Charlie's school to arrange her immediate withdrawal, then contacted Rebecca to begin the legal framework for what would become the Thompson Learning Foundation. By afternoon, he was meeting with architects about converting one of his commercial properties into an innovative educational space that would serve children regardless of their economic circumstances. But even as he planned for the future, crisis was erupting in the present. Janet Morrison's 48-hour deadline had arrived, and her report recommended immediate separation of Lily from Margaret, citing the grandmother's progressive dementia as evidence of an unsafe living environment. The state was prepared to place Lily in temporary foster care, while Margaret was moved to a county facility for individuals with cognitive impairment. The legal papers were served at 3 p.m. on a Thursday, giving them until Monday morning to contest the decision or comply with the separation order. David's family law attorney, Michael Santos, was blunt in his assessment. "The state has legitimate concerns about Margaret's capacity to provide care. Unless you can demonstrate alternative guardianship arrangements or significant changes to the current situation, they will proceed with placement." Lily took the news with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect permanence in anything good. She sat on the apartment's small couch, holding Margaret's hand while her grandmother hummed unconsciously, lost in whatever peaceful space her mind retreated to during its worst episodes. "It's okay, Mr. Harrison," Lily said quietly. "I always knew this was temporary. Good things usually are for people like us." The resignation in her voice broke David's heart more effectively than any tears could have. This child, who had given his daughter the gift of confidence and learning, who had taught him to see beyond the boundaries of class and circumstance, was preparing to accept defeat with a dignity that shamed every adult who had failed her. "No," David said firmly. "Good things don't have to be temporary. Sometimes they just require fighting for." Charlie, who had been silent since learning about both her school withdrawal and the threat to Lily's placement, suddenly stood up with an expression of determination that reminded David powerfully of her late mother. "Daddy, what if we adopted them? Both of them. Lily and Grandma Margaret. Then the state couldn't separate them, right?" The suggestion was so simple, so obvious, that David wondered why he hadn't thought of it immediately. But even as hope flickered, Michael Santos shook his head. Guardianship of a mentally impaired adult is complex, especially when combined with child adoption. The process could take months, and the court might still determine that Margaret requires specialized institutional care. "Then we find another way," David said, his mind racing through possibilities. "We create specialized care. We hire private medical staff. We build whatever system Margaret needs to remain safely with Lily." That evening, as Margaret slept and Lily and Charlie worked together on homework that would soon be transferred to an entirely different school, David made a series of phone calls that would reshape their futures. To Dr. Jennifer Walsh at USC, arranging for Margaret to audit advanced mathematics courses during her lucid periods. To the state's top geriatric psychiatrist, negotiating private consultation services. To his construction team, designing modifications to his Beverly Hills home that would accommodate Margaret's medical needs while providing Lily with the stability she deserved. By midnight, he had spent more money on legal fees and medical consultations than most families earned in a year. But for the first time since Elizabeth's death, he was spending money on something that felt like love rather than obligation, on building connection rather than maintaining distance. The final call was to Rebecca Chen, asking her to prepare the most important legal documents he had ever commissioned. Adoption papers that would make Lily Grace Thompson legally his daughter, and guardianship arrangements that would ensure Margaret's care while keeping their family intact. As he hung up the phone, David realized that he was no longer just saving Lily and Margaret. In fighting for their right to remain together, in choosing love over social expectation, he was saving himself and Charlie from a life measured in achievements rather than connections, in acquisitions rather than relationships. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time in years, David Harrison was fighting for something that truly mattered. The medical emergency struck at the worst possible moment, as if the universe had conspired to test every fragile bond they had built over the past months. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Sunday when Margaret's screams shattered the Silver Lake apartment's peaceful silence, pulling David from the first deep sleep he'd enjoyed in weeks. His phone buzzed with Lily's terrified voice. "Mr. Harrison, something's wrong with Grandma Maggie. She's shaking and she won't stop screaming about fire." David arrived at the apartment to find Lily crouched beside Margaret, who was convulsing on the living room floor, her eyes rolled back, foam specking her lips. The brilliant mathematician who had casually solved quantum computing problems just days earlier was now reduced to a trembling shell, her mind completely severed from reality by a neurological storm that threatened to erase whatever remained of her cognitive function. "How long has she been like this?" David asked, already dialing 911 while Lily tried to keep Margaret from injuring herself against the coffee table. 20 minutes, maybe more. She woke up screaming about the laboratory being on fire, about needing to save her research. Then she started shaking and couldn't hear me anymore." Lily's voice maintained its characteristic calm, but David could see the terror in her 12-year-old eyes. "Is she dying?" The ambulance ride to Cedars-Sinai felt like a descent into hell. Margaret's seizure had stopped, but she remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and erratic. Lily held her grandmother's hand, whispering mathematical equations like prayers, as if the language of numbers could somehow call Margaret back from whatever dark place her mind had retreated to. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the neurologist on call, delivered her initial assessment with the careful precision of someone accustomed to devastating news. "Mrs. Thompson is experiencing what we call status epilepticus, a prolonged seizure state that indicates significant deterioration in her underlying condition. The MRI shows increased brain atrophy consistent with rapidly advancing dementia, possibly triggered by the stress of recent life changes. David felt the words like physical blows. Are you saying that helping them, giving them stability, actually made her condition worse? I'm saying that sometimes the brain responds unpredictably to change, even positive change. What matters now is determining the best course of treatment. Dr. Rodriguez looked meaningfully at Lily, who was curled in a chair beside Margaret's hospital bed, still holding her grandmother's unresponsive hand. Given the severity of this episode and the documented progression of her cognitive decline, we need to discuss long-term care options that prioritize her safety and medical needs. The implication was clear. Margaret required institutional care that Lily, despite her remarkable maturity, could not provide. The state's intervention, which had seemed cruel and arbitrary just days earlier, now appeared prophetic. Janet Morrison's report had identified exactly the scenario that was now unfolding: a vulnerable child caring for an increasingly incapacitated adult in a situation that could only end in crisis. But as Margaret lay unconscious in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and IV lines, a different crisis was building in the hallway outside her room. Charlie had arrived with Rebecca Chen, David's attorney, carrying news that transformed their medical emergency into a legal catastrophe. The state has accelerated their timeline, Rebecca reported grimly. Margaret's hospitalization triggered an automatic review of Lily's placement. Child Protective Services is requiring immediate alternative arrangements. They're not waiting for Monday's hearing anymore. Janet Morrison appeared as if summoned by their conversation, her clipboard and bureaucratic authority intact despite the early morning hour. Mr. Harrison, given Mrs. Thompson's medical crisis, we need to implement emergency placement for Lily immediately. She cannot remain in an unsupervised situation while her guardian is incapacitated. David looked through the room's glass window at Lily, who was reading quietly to her unconscious grandmother from a mathematics textbook, her young voice steady and loving as she worked through complex theorems that Margaret had taught her during lucid moments. The sight of this child, maintaining vigil beside the woman who had raised her, refusing to abandon hope even when faced with overwhelming medical evidence, crystallized every protective instinct David had developed over the past months. "What if I provided immediate supervision?" David asked. "Lily could stay at my house tonight, maintain hospital visitation, while we work through the legal arrangements we've already initiated." Janet Morrison's expression suggested she had been expecting this proposal. "Mr. Harrison, while your intentions are admirable, temporary housing arrangements don't address the fundamental issues here. Lily needs stable, long-term placement with qualified guardians who can address her educational and emotional needs appropriately." "I am qualified. I'm adopting her." "Adoption proceedings take months, sir, and require extensive background checks, home studies, and court approval." "The child needs immediate placement." The bureaucratic catch-22 was maddening in its logic. Lily couldn't stay with David because the legal adoption process took too long. But she couldn't stay with Margaret because Margaret's condition made her an unfit guardian. The system, designed to protect children, was instead dismantling the family bonds that had sustained Lily through years of hardship. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from Margaret's room with an update that complicated everything further. "Mrs. Thompson is stable but remains unconscious. However, we found something interesting in her blood work. She's been taking medications that aren't prescribed to her, specifically early-stage Alzheimer's drugs that are still in clinical trials. Powerful medications that require careful monitoring and aren't typically available outside research settings." The revelation raised new questions about Margaret's condition and her access to experimental treatments. David found himself wondering about the depth of Margaret's connections to the medical research community, about resources and relationships that had remained hidden throughout their acquaintance. As if summoned by their need for answers, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from USC arrived at the hospital carrying a folder that would reshape their understanding of Margaret's situation. I came as soon as I heard about Margaret's hospitalization. There are things about her background that you need to understand, especially now. Dr. Walsh led them to a quiet conference room where she opened the folder to reveal documents that had been sealed for decades. Margaret Chen Thompson isn't just a retired mathematics professor. She's one of the foundational researchers in artificial intelligence, a contemporary of Turing and von Neumann. Her work in the 1970s and 80s laid the groundwork for modern machine learning algorithms. The papers showed patents, research grants, and consulting agreements that painted a picture of intellectual brilliance and significant financial resources. Margaret had been receiving royalties from her early AI research for decades, payments that should have ensured comfortable retirement, but had apparently been diverted or hidden. "Where did the money go?" David asked, studying bank statements that showed regular deposits followed by immediate transfers to accounts he couldn't identify. "Rick Thompson's medical bills," Dr. Walsh explained sadly. "Margaret spent everything trying to get him the best PTSD treatment available. When traditional therapy failed, she paid for experimental programs, alternative treatments, anything that might help her stepson recover from his war trauma. She liquidated her retirement accounts, sold her home, even borrowed against future royalties to fund his care. The truth was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Margaret's apparent poverty wasn't the result of professional failure or poor planning, but rather the consequence of love. A grandmother who had sacrificed her own security to heal the damaged son who had become her child through marriage and choice rather than blood. "But there's more," Dr. Walsh continued, pulling out additional documents. "Margaret's experimental medications. She's been participating in a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins. She's not just taking random drugs. She's part of a longitudinal study on early intervention in dementia progression. The treatment she's receiving could potentially slow or even reverse some aspects of her cognitive decline." The clinical trial represented both hope and complication. Margaret's participation required careful medical supervision and regular travel to Baltimore for testing and evaluation. The logistics of maintaining her enrollment while providing Lily with stable guardianship seemed increasingly impossible. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, painting the hospital corridors in pale gold light, David found himself facing decisions that would determine multiple futures. Charlie had fallen asleep in a waiting room chair, her homework scattered around her like autumn leaves. Lily maintained her vigil beside Margaret's bed, reading mathematics problems aloud to her unconscious grandmother with the faith that love could penetrate even medical coma. Janet Morrison returned with morning shift change, carrying paperwork that formalized the state's position. "Mr. Harrison, we need to finalize placement arrangements for Lily by noon today. The temporary emergency custody cannot continue indefinitely." David looked at the forms that would separate this family, that would place Lily in foster care while Margaret recovered in a facility far from everything familiar. The bureaucratic machinery of child protection, designed to help, was instead preparing to inflict the very trauma it claimed to prevent. "Give me 2 hours," David said finally. 2 hours to present an alternative arrangement that addresses all your concerns while keeping this family intact." "Sir, we've been through this adoption procedures." "Not adoption," David interrupted. "Something else. Something immediate and legally binding that protects Lily while maintaining Margaret's rights and dignity." Janet Morrison checked her watch, calculating bureaucratic risk against human compassion. 2 hours, Mr. Harrison. But if you can't present a viable solution by noon, we proceed with emergency placement." As she left, David pulled out his phone to make the most important call of his business career. Not to acquire a company or close a deal, but to save a family that had taught him the true meaning of success. The next 2 hours would determine whether love could triumph over systems, whether individual action could overcome institutional inertia. The battle for Lily and Margaret's future was entering its final phase, and David Harrison was about to discover whether his wealth and influence could purchase the one thing money had never been able to buy: time. The revelation came not from lawyers or social workers, but from a faded photograph that fell from Margaret's purse as nurses gathered her belongings. Lily picked up the black and white image, her breath catching as she recognized the faces: a young Margaret standing beside a tall man in military uniform, both of them beaming at the camera with the innocent joy of people who believed their future was unlimited. "Grandma Maggie," Lily whispered to the unconscious figure on the hospital bed, "who is this man with you?" Dr. Walsh, who had remained at the hospital despite the early hour, looked over Lily's shoulder and gasped. "That's Dr. James Chen, Margaret's first husband. He died in Vietnam in 1968. She paused, studying the photograph more carefully. "But there's something else. Look at the background. That's the MIT campus. And the date stamp, 1967. David felt a chill of recognition. "What's significant about 1967? That's when Margaret was awarded her PhD in theoretical mathematics. She was 23, the youngest woman ever to receive that degree from MIT. But James was killed just 3 months after this photo was taken, while Margaret was pregnant with their first child." The pieces of Margaret's hidden history began falling into place like a tragic puzzle. Dr. Walsh continued, her voice heavy with newfound understanding. "Margaret lost the baby in her 7th month. Stress and grief, the doctors said. She never had another child. When she married Rick Thompson's father years later, Rick became the son she'd never had." Lily looked up from the photograph, her young face displaying wisdom far beyond her years. "That's why she loves me so much. I'm not just her step-granddaughter. I'm the family she thought she'd lost forever." As if summoned by the power of her name being spoken, Margaret's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 6 hours. Her gaze was unfocused initially, but gradually settled on Lily's face with startling clarity. "Lily, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse but coherent. "Where are we? Why does everything feel so strange?" "We're in the hospital, Grandma Maggie. You had a seizure, but you're better now." Margaret's hand reached for Lily's with surprising strength. "I remember. I was dreaming about James, about the baby we lost. They were both waiting for me in a beautiful garden, telling me it wasn't time yet, that I still had work to finish here." Her eyes moved to David, standing quietly at the foot of the bed. "With you, dear. My work is with you." Dr. Rodriguez arrived for her morning rounds to find Margaret not only conscious, but displaying cognitive function that contradicted every expectation based on her previous condition. "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell me what year it is?" 2023, December 15th. "I'm in Cedars-Sinai Hospital because my granddaughter was frightened by an old woman's medical episode." Margaret's smile was gentle but sharp. "Dr. Rodriguez, I presume, your reputation in neurology precedes you?" The medical team was baffled. Margaret's brain scans showed the same deterioration as before, but her mental acuity appeared dramatically improved. Dr. Walsh had a theory that stunned everyone in the room. What if Margaret's dementia isn't purely degenerative? What if it's partially trauma-induced, triggered by losing Rick and then facing potential separation from Lily? Sometimes the brain protects itself from unbearable grief by retreating from reality. When the threat of loss is removed, the mind can return," Margaret finished, her voice strong and certain. "I've been fighting to stay present for Lily, but the fear of failing her, of being taken away from the last family I have left, was drowning out everything else." David stepped forward, his decision crystallizing with Margaret's lucid words. "Then we remove that fear permanently." He pulled out his phone and called Rebecca Chen with instructions that would change everything. "Rebecca, I need you to prepare guardianship papers immediately. Not adoption proceedings, guardianship. I want legal authority to make medical and educational decisions for both Lily and Margaret while preserving Margaret's rights and dignity. Can it be done today? Guardianship can be expedited in emergency situations, but, David, this is unprecedented. You're talking about assuming responsibility for a child and a mentally impaired adult simultaneously. I'm talking about keeping a family together." The legal maneuvering that followed was a masterclass in using wealth and connections for genuinely noble purposes. Rebecca assembled a team of specialists who descended on the hospital with paperwork, medical evaluations, and character references. David's personal physician conducted immediate health assessments. A family court judge was contacted for an emergency hearing. But the most crucial element came from Margaret herself. During her period of restored lucidity, she dictated a legal document that would later be called one of the most moving testaments ever filed in Los Angeles County Family Court. "I, Margaret Chen Thompson, being of sound mind and clear purpose, hereby request that David Harrison be granted guardianship over myself and my granddaughter, Lily Grace Thompson. Mr. Harrison has demonstrated the kind of unconditional love and commitment that defines family better than blood or law ever could. In granting him this authority, I am not surrendering my dignity or my rights. I am choosing to entrust the people I love most to someone who has proven worthy of that trust." The document continued with specific provisions that protected Margaret's autonomy during lucid periods while ensuring comprehensive care during medical episodes. It established educational trusts for Lily, medical directives for Margaret's ongoing treatment, and perhaps most importantly, legal recognition of their chosen family structure. Janet Morrison arrived at the hospital at 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes before her deadline, to find a completely transformed situation. Instead of a child in crisis requiring emergency placement, she found Lily sitting beside Margaret's bed, both of them working on mathematical problems while David consulted with a team of lawyers and medical specialists. "Mr. Harrison," Janet said carefully, "what exactly has transpired here?" "What's transpired is that we've created a legally binding arrangement that addresses every concern your department has raised while preserving this family's integrity." David handed her a folder thick with documentation: legal guardianship with immediate effect, comprehensive medical care plans, educational provisions, and financial security. Everything your system requires, but structured to serve love rather than bureaucracy. Janet reviewed the documents with the thoroughness of someone who had seen too many well-intentioned arrangements collapse under real-world pressure, but as she read, her expression shifted from skepticism to amazement. "This is unprecedented. You're assuming legal responsibility for both a child and an adult with significant medical needs. The financial obligations alone are irrelevant," David interrupted gently. "What matters is that Lily and Margaret stay together, that they receive the care and support they deserve, and that the love they share is protected rather than destroyed by systems that claim to help." Margaret spoke from her hospital bed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated decades of institutional resistance. "Miss Morrison, I've spent my life watching brilliant minds be wasted by systems that value conformity over creativity, order over love. David is offering something radical, the chance for a family to define itself by choice rather than chance, by commitment rather than convenience." At 11:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the state's deadline for Lily's emergency placement, Janet Morrison signed the paperwork that officially recognized David Harrison as guardian of both Lily Grace Thompson and Margaret Chen Thompson. The battle was won, but as David looked at his newly expanded family, he realized that victory was just the beginning. The real work of healing, of building, of proving that love could triumph over every obstacle, was about to begin. 6 months later, the Thompson Learning Center buzzed with the controlled chaos of minds being liberated from the constraints of traditional education. What had once been a sterile Harrison Tech satellite office had been transformed into something revolutionary, an educational space where homeless children sat beside tech executives' kids, where grandmother volunteers taught alongside MIT professors, where learning happened not because of economic privilege but despite its absence. David stood in the main classroom, watching Lily guide a group of 8th graders through advanced calculus concepts, while Charlie led younger students in an exploration of geometric patterns found in nature. Both girls wore matching Thompson Center t-shirts, but more importantly, they wore expressions of pure joy that came from discovering their own capacity to change lives through teaching. Margaret, her silver hair braided with colorful ribbons donated by kindergarten students, sat at a corner desk surrounded by teenagers who hung on her every word as she explained the mathematical relationships underlying music theory. Her dementia hadn't disappeared, but it had stabilized into predictable patterns that allowed her to teach during lucid hours and rest peacefully during confused periods. The experimental treatments, now fully covered by the Foundation's medical program, had slowed her cognitive decline to the point where she could contribute meaningfully to the educational mission she had helped design. "Grandma Maggie," one of the students asked, "how did you know that Beethoven was actually using mathematical sequences in his symphonies?" Margaret's eyes sparkled with the delight of someone who had spent decades waiting for that exact question. "Because music and mathematics are the same language, dear one. They're both ways of describing the patterns that hold the universe together." Beethoven wasn't conscious of using Fibonacci sequences, but his ear heard the harmony they created. Dr. Patricia Whitman entered the classroom carrying a stack of evaluation forms, her presence no longer representing institutional judgment, but rather the humility of someone who had learned to see beyond her own limitations. After resigning from Westfield Academy, she had joined the Thompson Center as Director of Educational Innovation, bringing 3 decades of administrative experience to serve a mission that valued inclusion over exclusion. "David," she said quietly, approaching him during a break between classes, "the quarterly assessments are remarkable. Our students are outperforming their previous schools across every metric, but more importantly, they're developing emotional intelligence and social awareness that traditional institutions struggle to cultivate." David smiled, watching Charlie patiently help a shy 9-year-old overcome his fear of multiplication tables. "It turns out that when you remove the barriers between different types of students, economic, social, academic, they teach each other things that no curriculum could ever capture." The center served 200 children daily, ranging from homeless youth like Lily had been to affluent kids whose parents chose the Thompson model over elite private schools. Sliding scale tuition meant that no child was turned away for financial reasons, while comprehensive support services ensured that housing insecurity, food access, and medical needs never prevented learning. Rebecca Chen arrived with the afternoon's most anticipated visitor, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who had been documenting Margaret's remarkable cognitive stability for a medical journal article that would revolutionize understanding of trauma-induced dementia. "Margaret," Dr. Rodriguez said warmly, "I have wonderful news. Johns Hopkins wants to expand their clinical trial based on your progress. They're particularly interested in how emotional security and purposeful engagement can slow degenerative processes." Margaret looked up from her students with characteristic directness. "Dr. Rodriguez, I appreciate the scientific interest, but I should clarify something important. My improvement isn't primarily medical, it's environmental. When you remove fear and replace it with love, when you give someone purpose instead of pity, the brain responds accordingly." The afternoon's final surprise came in the form of a familiar Honda Civic pulling into the center's parking lot. Rick Thompson stepped out of the car. Not the broken veteran who had taken his own life, but his cousin Michael Thompson, a software engineer from Portland who had been searching for his family since hearing news reports about the Thompson Center. "I saw the story about Margaret and Lily on the national news," Michael explained as tears streamed down his face. "I've been looking for them since Rick's funeral, but they seem to have disappeared. I never imagined they were here, building something this beautiful." Lily ran into her newfound uncle's arms, completing a circle of connection that had been broken by tragedy, but restored by intentional love. Margaret embraced her nephew-in-law with the fierce joy of someone who had thought her family complete but discovered it could still grow. As the sun set over Los Angeles, painting the Learning Center in golden light, David gathered his chosen family around the oak tree that had been transplanted to the center's courtyard. The same tree where Charlie and Lily had first met, where their friendship had bloomed into something that transformed everyone it touched. "A year ago," David said, looking at the faces that had become his deepest joy, "I thought success meant building walls high enough to protect what I valued. Now I know that true success means building bridges strong enough to connect what matters most." Margaret squeezed Lily's hand while Charlie leaned against David's shoulder, and Michael marveled at the family that had somehow survived and thrived despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. "Sometimes," Lily said softly, "the best families are the ones we choose to build, one day at a time, one act of love at a time." In the distance, children's laughter echoed from the Learning Center as evening tutoring sessions began, the sound carrying on the wind like a promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that kindness, given freely and without condition, could indeed change the world. Dear friends, if you've lived through 6 decades like I have, you know that life's greatest treasures often come disguised as interruptions to our carefully planned days. David Harrison thought success meant building walls high enough to protect what he valued, until a 12-year-old homeless girl teaching his daughter under an oak tree showed him that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, it's measured in the lives we touch and the love we choose to share. How many of us have walked past our own Lily, someone whose brilliant light we missed because we were too busy protecting our comfortable distance from life's messiness? Margaret, at 68, discovered that her greatest contribution wasn't the mathematical theorems she'd published, but the wisdom she shared with children who saw past her dementia to the treasure of knowledge within. This story reminds us that it's never too late to choose connection over comfort, to build bridges instead of barriers, and to discover that the family we create through love often runs deeper than the one we inherit through blood. Sometimes our most profound purpose reveals itself not in our achievements, but in our willingness to see potential where others see problems. What moments in your life taught you that true success isn't about what you accumulate, but about the connections you nurture? Have you ever encountered someone who changed your perspective on what really matters? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.